Good afternoon, and welcome to the second in our three-part Made by McGill Alumni webcast series as we explore the many ways in which our world and our lives have been upended by the coronavirus pandemic and ask some of our leading McGill experts what we can do to prepare for these unprecedented changes. My name is Derek Kassoff, Managing Director of Communications at McGill's Office of University Advancement, and it's Tuesday, August 31st. Today, we turn our attention to a topic that is no doubt keeping many people up at night: money. More specifically, is the pandemic to blame for the rising cost of goods and services? Will these inflationary pressures affect our ability to save for a rainy day and ultimately for retirement? And other than, say, Amazon shareholders, who might ultimately come out ahead economically when the pandemic is finally behind us? I'm not sure whether the two gentlemen joining us today can answer all of these questions, but they will likely come as close as anybody can. So let's meet them. With us is Christopher Ragan, who's an associate professor in McGill's Department of Economics and director of McGill's Max Bell School of Public Policy, one of Canada's leading teaching and research centers on the study and practice of sound public policy. And Benjamin Croitoru, who is an associate professor of finance in the Desautels Faculty of Management and academic director of McGill Personal Finance Essentials, an 8-part online course that teaches the general public about budgeting, saving, and investing. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for taking time out of your busy days to join us for what I think will be a very important conversation. And before we get started, a reminder that if you are watching live and you have questions for our panelists, you can send them to us via email at aoc@mcgill.ca, and we'll do our best to address them to our guests. So welcome, professors. Maybe Professor Ragan, I'll start with you if I may. So for those of us who casually follow economic news, these can be confusing times to figure out. Job numbers seem to suggest that the economy is rebounding. The stock market has continued to hit record highs throughout the pandemic, and politicians all sound optimistic that better days are ahead. I guess that's what politicians do. And yet every time I go to a restaurant, a grocery store, or a gas station, I can't help but notice how much more expensive things seem to be. So what are us lay people supposed to make of the economic landscape that we're now facing?
Thank you for that question, Derek, and thank you for inviting me to this. So the question you just asked is one that we could actually spend an hour talking about. We could spend 6 hours talking about it, but we've only got 3 minutes. So what happened? This was a very different kind of economic shock. If you think back to March and April of last year, we got hit with the pandemic. Even once you got your head around what the idea was, very few people had a good sense of what this meant for the economy. The stock market plunged, and the economy actually shrank dramatically. In the second quarter, in particular of last year, the economy shrank by about 15%. But it didn't last for long because it took a while to realize that, okay, we're going to actually slowly now reopen some sectors of the economy. The stock market actually, which is very much a forward-looking market, realized that this wasn't actually the end of Western civilization as we knew it, that there would be a recovery. And so the stock market actually recovered very quickly. Where we are now, Derek, is in a situation where total income in the economy or employment, because they roughly move together, are about 2% below where they were at the peak of the pre-pandemic world. Okay, so if you go back to January of 2020, we are about 2% below that. Now that's still a fair ways below, but of course it's not 15% below anymore. So, and what we've seen over the last few months is a recovery as sectors of the economy reopen and people go back to work and employment rises and income rises, but it's a bumpy road. As you noticed in today's data, GDP actually fell in the second quarter of this year, and that wasn't anticipated. So that's where we're going. I think we've still got a lot of recovery to go, but we are past the worst of it economically, and hopefully it won't return.
Okay, that was an incredibly, incredibly succinct and very good update for us. But let me just ask you a follow-up question, if I may. I mean, obviously there are so many data you can look at. As you mentioned today, the economic numbers came out and the economy is contracting. Jobs seem to be going up. The stock market is more or less up almost every other week. So, I mean, what are the economic benchmarks that we ought to be keeping an eye on in the weeks and months ahead? Or are there specific data points that you as an economist are going to be paying attention to as you gauge the health of the economy and this recovery?
So we can look at 150 different pieces of data, and the people at the Bank of Canada and the Department of Finance are looking at all 150 of them. But I actually think if you wanted to boil it down to a couple, I would focus on national income, which is gross domestic product, GDP, and employment, because those two things tend to move together. And those are the things that are really important in terms of, how much activity is there in the economy, how much income there is. Employment obviously matters. People want to get back to work. So I would focus on GDP and employment. And you can, if you want, you can track employment monthly. GDP only comes a little bit less frequently, but you can track employment monthly. If you, Google Canadian employment, you can track it by the month.
Okay, great. That's very helpful to know. So Professor Croitoru, I'll turn to you now. So as someone who specializes in understanding how people budget, save, and invest their money, I'm curious to know from your perspective, how are we doing, generally speaking, as a nation of consumers and savers? And has the pandemic changed any of the fundamentals behind spending and saving?
Great questions. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here. Well, you're asking, two questions in one, right? Mm-hmm. How are we doing? Unfortunately, I would say overall not that great. I mean, if you look at various surveys, they tend to reveal more or less the same thing, that roughly close to 50% of Canadians are or feel that they are in a precarious financial situation. And what we also see is that the amount of debt, and especially high interest debt, that's not very healthy, like credit card debt, has been increasing a lot in recent years, and of course that's contributing to that feeling of insecurity. However, I am encouraged. So I'm going to do a little bit of advertising for my own project. I'm encouraged by the fact that obviously a lot of people are eager to learn, and I've seen that firsthand because our online personal finance program has been very successful with over 200,000 people who have signed up. Now, you were asking me about has the pandemic changed any of the fundamentals? I don't think so. So of course, there's some tweaking that can be done to your financial plan to take into account what has happened in the recent past. But in my opinion, the pandemic is mostly a good opportunity to reiterate some of the old time-tested advice that is still as true as it has always been. So let me give one example. So Chris was talking about what the stock market did last year and how quickly it rebounded. Well, I think that's a good example that shows you that it's a bad idea to sell your investments in a panic, because you see what happened around March of 2020. Well, we didn't know. Things looked pretty bad, to say the least, and we saw the stock market lose more than 30% in just a few weeks. And of course, why was the stock market going down like this? Because lots of people were selling, right? But then you saw how quickly the stock market recovered, and it's actually been doing amazingly well, unexpectedly well since then. What this is telling you is that a lot of people, those people who stuck in a panic, lost a lot of money in a short time. And when this kind of panic happens, it's very easy compared to somebody who would have done nothing, would just have kept their investment in the market without buying, without selling. It's very easy to lose 30% or more of your money in just a few months. So I think this is probably possibly the biggest mistake that individual investors tend to make, selling in a panic when things look really bleak.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you a follow-up question, Professor Croitoru. You said that the pandemic hasn't really changed the fundamentals of how we should be thinking about saving and investing, but do you think it's changed the sort of psychological behavior of people around savings? I mean, has the pandemic maybe scared people a little bit? We keep talking about saving for a rainy day. I mean, was this the rainy day that shocked people into maybe thinking a bit more about saving?
Probably a little bit. I am skeptical. I mean, I'm taking myself as an example. At this point, I really feel like spending money because I kind of feel I dodged the bullet.
Mhm.
So yes, people saved quite a bit, and that was actually one piece of data that was encouraging. For the first time in many years, the amount of credit card debts that Canadians owe went down. I
Mhm.
think, but simply because for a while people didn't spend as much money or couldn't spend as much money. But I am very skeptical that this is going to last. And one reason is that there's a lot of marketing money being spent on encouraging people to keep spending,
Mhm.
or resume spending.
Right. So we'll come back to that notion later on in this
Mhm.
webcast, because I think the whole notion of spending and people's psychology around that is going to be critically important to this conversation.
Sure.
I do want to bring Professor Ragan back in because we featured you actually on one of our earliest webcasts in April of 2020, very early days of the pandemic, and we spoke quite a bit back then about how governments here in Canada and elsewhere were pouring billions of dollars into social programs and relief packages to keep families and individuals afloat during the pandemic, and to support industries that were being hit particularly hard by lockdowns and travel restrictions, even though it meant taking on additional debt and running up enormous budget deficits. So my question to you back then, and I'll ask you the question again now, almost 18 months later, is what happens next? I mean, is the bill about to come due for taxpayers?
So, Derek, can you tell me what I said the answer was 18 months ago?
I think you said something to the effect of, oh, governments will probably just push this off for 30 years and our kids will pay for it.
Well, that may turn out to be the case. So we have gone through, it's been a tremendous economic and health shock. And as you just said, our federal government, but also the federal governments in many other advanced countries have taken an approach to this, which was that they needed to provide financial relief to households, millions of households and millions of businesses, small and large, to basically build a bridge until the time in the future when they could continue generating income. And that's what CERB, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, was about. That's what the wage subsidies were about. It was providing financial relief. It wasn't designed to stimulate the economy in any significant way. It was designed to allow people, basically, to stay at home and be safe from a public health pandemic issue, but to actually provide them with the income that they needed to, buy their groceries and pay their rent. And because Canada was in a much better fiscal situation than many other advanced countries, our public debt as a ratio of our national income was the lowest among all of the G7 countries and even the equally advanced countries that aren't in the G7. We ended up doing more of that than other countries. We also had a federal government that frankly didn't mind spending money. So Canada actually did more of that financial relief than other advanced countries. We actually ran a budget deficit of about 18% of GDP last year. That's a huge budget deficit. All goes on to our debt. And now the question is, what are we going to do about that? And one of my complaints, and you'll probably come to a question about the election because we're in the middle of one, is that I think as a government and as a nation, we're probably not talking enough about how we're going to make sure that that debt doesn't take off, because government debt has a habit of sort of taking on a life of its own, and you actually have to work hard to prevent it from increasing. And I think we're not talking enough about that. But I think what the future is going to hold for us as a country is we're going to make some tough decisions. We're going to have to decide whether we want to bring down that debt to GDP ratio back again to where it was. Will that require an increase in taxes? If it does, which kinds of taxes will go up? Or will it require a reduction in other spending by governments? Probably not a reduction in the healthcare sector, but maybe a reduction elsewhere. So I think there's a question of fundamentally about government priorities that we are going to have to face in the next few years. And I hope we do face it in the next few years and start having a serious conversation about that. But it's not being talked about in today's election campaign, that's for sure.
Okay, so, and you mentioned the election. And in fact, my next question, my follow-up question to you was going to be about that election. Clearly 18 months ago when we spoke, we didn't think we'd be in an election campaign or election this soon. So I'm curious to get your take on that. Prime Minister Trudeau says he called the election in order to give Canadians a voice in how the country and presumably the economy is managed as we emerge from the pandemic. So I guess my question to you is, have you noticed any discernible differences in the platforms and visions laid out by the major parties? Are they even talking about this? Or to put it even more bluntly, do Canadians truly have a say in terms of influencing what major policy decisions face us?
Well, okay, so you've got a few questions in there. I think Canadians do have a say. I mean, ultimately, our elected leaders do worry about what the people say and think, and that's appropriate because that's the way democracy runs. So I do think we have a say, and we have a say by choosing who we want to be the government. Um, I think all of the parties aren't, for the most part, talking about the issue that we were just talking about, budget deficits and taxes and rising government debt. They aren't talking about it. I think they've all decided that they don't want to talk about that because that's an uncomfortable, a difficult conversation, and that's unfortunate. But there's certainly lots of differences on other issues. There's lots of differences across the parties. They differ in terms of their climate policies. They differ in terms of lots of details. I mean, every day you're seeing announcements from the three main party leaders, Trudeau, O'Toole, and Singh, on various things. They're trying to carve out differentiate positions, and I think they are successfully differentiating themselves. But it's not on big things, I would say. It's on a whole bunch of smaller things,
Right.
Mostly.
Okay. All right. Just a reminder for anyone who is watching live, if you have any questions for our panelists, you can send them to us by email at aoc@mcgill.ca. So Professor Croitoru, let me come back to you. So as we come out on the other side of this pandemic, and I think many of us thought we would be there a little bit sooner than we are, in fact, but we will be there eventually. We know that there's segments of the population that are now sitting on large piles of disposable income. So people that have kept their jobs and incomes intact during the last 18 months and have actually been unable to spend on things like travel and dining and other big ticket items because of lockdowns and travel restrictions. So what advice would you have for people who suddenly find themselves with a bit more pocket change? Is now the time for them to start thinking about savings and investment? Or as you suggested, is it going to be spend now that they can?
Well, I think it's always, when something a little bit out of the ordinary happens, I think it's a good time to try drawing a few lessons. And again, as I said, I think earlier, I don't think anything fundamental has really changed, but there are a few things we can observe in the we can point out in the current situation. One thing is that, well, clearly, stocks have been going up for a while at this point. They are relatively expensive compared to corporate profits. That doesn't mean that the crash is coming, but it means that we should expect lower returns than we have seen in the past, which means probably if you don't want to run out of money, if you don't want to be poor in retirement, or if you want to have more money to leave to your kids, probably you want to save a little more. It might be necessary to save a little more than in the past. Couple other things I'd like to mention. So of course, it's not just the stock market that has been going up a lot. We've seen real estate go up a lot in many different markets. And I strongly suspect that a lot of people are in a little bit of a panic because they feel, well, if they don't own a home, they think it's going to be increasingly difficult to buy. Well, I want to tell them not to panic over this. I think it's important to tell people that you can have a financially healthy life without owning your home. Okay, and I think we don't have time to discuss. So actually, should you buy, should you rent? It's a very complicated decision because it depends on so many factors. But the conventional wisdom that tends to suggest that you're throwing your money out the window by renting instead of buying is not necessarily true, especially when real estate prices have been going on a lot. So I tell people, if you don't own your home, if you don't feel you're going to be able to buy, don't panic over that.
Right. But do you, in terms of the real estate prices in particular, I mean, do you feel that we're in a housing bubble because of the pandemic? Is this really a short-term phenomenon where people just felt panicked? I've got to get out of downtown. It's busy. There's viruses here. I need to go buy a big house in the suburbs? Or is just this real estate's always going to go up in price?
I think bubbles are only obvious when you don't want to take a stand on this. I mean, I own my home, and I'm not planning to sell it anytime soon. That's what I will say. But again, I'm telling our listeners, if you don't own, don't panic. that doesn't
Right.
mean you're in a poor financial situation.
Okay.
Derek, can I jump in on the housing issue?
Yeah, please.
So I think Benjamin is absolutely right that there's nothing wrong with being a renter. But I think there are many people, like I've got children who are late 20s, early 30s, and I think their mindset is they want to own a detached house. And I think people in that generation, and this actually relates to our environmental issues as well, and city density issues and city sprawl. I actually think we may be changing, moving in a different direction. And I think that's going to be a hard thing to mentally adjust. But also, I think housing has become a very important, I suspect, national issue, maybe even an election issue, in a way that it wasn't true 10 years ago or 5 years ago. There was actually a very good editorial in the Globe and Mail either yesterday or today, because all my days now mixed together, but the last couple of days, and it was titled something like "What Not to Do to Fix the Housing Crisis." And it was a very good op-ed, or a very good editorial. And I think one of the problems is that governments are looking for quick fixes, and quick fixes are usually, well, let's help people who are having a hard time to buy a house. Let's help them by giving them more incentives. We give them a tax credit, or we give them something like that. And I actually think that's just feeding the problem. I think the long-term solution to this in Canada is to build more houses, but that requires, the federal government actually can't do much on that. That requires municipalities, cities, to actually change their zoning restrictions and reduce the obstacles to building supply. And that gets into NIMBYism, where people really don't want, medium density housing at the end of my nice block in my neighborhood of detached houses. So that gets into all kinds of pretty difficult politics, actually. But I actually think this is going to become a sort of top 5 issue in this country if it hasn't already become there. And I don't think we're dealing with it very well.
So speaking again of the election, you brought it up, and that reminded me. So I know that there was a poll that came out, I think, last week, where they asked Canadians, what are the biggest issues that you're concerned about? I think number 1, if I'm not mistaken, was cost of living. So maybe I'll stick with you, Professor Ragan, because I do want to ask you about cost of living and inflation. I think obviously, as we're talking about the economy, this is on the minds of a lot of people these days. Gasoline prices, for instance, are up about 50% in the last few months. We've heard stories about, otherwise innocuous items like lumber, which seems to be priced as if they're precious metals. So I guess my question to you is, are these sharp cost increases based on supply and demand that may be unique to particular goods and services? Or are we coming out of the pandemic and entering a period where we'll just have to get used to paying a lot more for everything?
Well, also a great question that we could talk about for several hours. So I think some of these price increases are very much related to the massive disruption we had in supply chains that lasted for basically a year. Not so much gasoline. Gasoline fell in price dramatically, or oil fell in price dramatically when the economies all collapsed, and then now it's coming back. Today, the price of a liter of gasoline is not fundamentally different than it was 18 months ago, but it fell and then it increased again. But there's a lot of, you mentioned lumber, there's a lot of things like lumber, building supplies in general, and all kinds of specific products all over the place where they are hard to get. And if you can get them, they're very expensive. And I think that is because of the disrupted supply chains. And I think that is just going to take a while to fix up. And that's going to require kind of a full recovery of the economy in terms of people getting back to work and those supply chains being restored. So that's one thing. And that's largely a temporary phenomenon. Okay, but temporary still might last, a year or two. But then there is whether we are moving into a world of higher inflation across the board. And this gets you into a discussion about central banks and the massive increases in the money supply, basically, that central banks have engineered over the past year, and whether that's appropriate and whether they are then going to take actions necessary to slow that down as the economy is recovering. And that is also something I actually think we're maybe not talking enough about. What I hear when I listen to central banks speak is that they are still going to leave that monetary expansion in place for several more quarters, even while they see inflation starting to rise, because they claim that inflation is just temporary. I think they may not be putting enough emphasis on the possibility that their actions are starting to actually create that longer lasting inflation. Now, I don't think we're a return to 1922 Germany with hyperinflation, but I do think we could easily be in a world where inflation becomes 5% or 7% if central banks don't start taking serious action.
Mhm. So, Professor Croitoru, from your perspective as someone who's counseling people on investing and saving, I mean, what advice do you have then if we're looking at a world of inflation of 5 or 7% annual inflation? How are people supposed to save and stay afloat and sort of beat those, save enough money to sort of pay for their cost of living and their retirement?
I mean, it's a tough question, and by the way, I'm not taking a stand. I don't know what's going to happen. The way I try to think of as an investor is, well, you should ideally have different scenarios about what can happen in the future, and of course, maybe some of them are going to be more likely than others. And definitely, high inflation is one of the scenarios. And then you should try to have a policy, an investment policy that does okay, at least okay, under all of those likely scenarios.
Mhm.
About inflation is that what I want to say is that for long-term investors, inflation is not the worst thing that can happen. And what we can see if we look at the long term, the historical data, is that in the long term, stocks have done okay, even in the presence of high inflation, not in the short term.
Mhm.
And then if you are I think this, I don't want to get too technical for today's podcast. If you are very worried about inflation, there are ways that you can tilt a stock portfolio. For example, you could invest more in commodity producers. There are ways that you can customize your stock portfolio to make it do better in case high inflation
Mhm.
occurs.
Okay, great. So I was going to reserve a little bit of time at the end for questions from alumni, but we did receive one that's just come in that's, again, very specific to inflation. So maybe I'll get to that one right now. Maybe I'll address it to you, Professor Ragan. It comes to us from Victor Barbaros. So he writes, why is there a discrepancy between the inflation reported to the public and the actual prices for essential products? So the inflation rate is not too far from the usual 2 to 3%, but we see higher prices for bread, milk, fruits, veggies that have increased more than twice or three times more than that.
So, Victor, this is a great question, and you'll be delighted to know that it is actually a reasonably common question. There's a lot of frustration where people say, well, the officials are telling us that inflation is only 2.4%, but man, I know it's not, because the beef that I'm buying has gone up in price, or something else has gone up massively. And the truth is that both of those are true. So when Statistics Canada or the Bank of Canada or the Government of Canada tells you that inflation over the past year was 2.4%, and I'm making up that number, but it'll be about that, a little higher maybe, that's actually true. What it is it's a measure of the average prices in the economy. It's not the measure of every price in the economy. So, your beef may be getting more expensive, your gasoline may be getting more expensive, but your cell phone packages are falling in price, your flat screen TVs are falling in price, something else is falling in price. And statistically, they are taking an average over 100,000 different goods and services. So I think you can trust the Bank of Canada and the Government of Canada and Statistics Canada to give you the right data on average, but you may not be the average Canadian consumer, right? So I don't smoke. So if I see the price of cigarettes go up or down, I don't really care because it doesn't affect me. And if the price of whiskey goes up or down, I don't really care because I don't drink whiskey. I never figured out how to drink that stuff, right? But if the price of wine goes up and down, I notice that. And if the price of beef goes up and down, I notice that. So we're all a little bit different from the average, but the average is the average. And that's what the official data is giving us.
Right. Well, great question, Victor, and great answer, Professor Ragan. So let me stick with you, Professor Ragan, for this next question. So I joked at the outset of the webcast about how Amazon and its shareholders have emerged as economic winners during the pandemic. In fact, I just read last week that Amazon has now surpassed Walmart as the largest retailer in the world. Walmart was there for 30 years, I think. So, and I suppose we can add video conference companies like Zoom and streaming services like Netflix to this list of winners. But I'm just curious, has the pandemic and the behaviors that it may have temporarily forced on consumers, do you think it's fundamentally changed certain industries forever? So I'm thinking of like, just traditional brick and mortar shops or movie theaters, now that people have had a year and a half of Netflix, or even downtown real estate developers, who knows what's going to happen with office workers coming back. So, it seems that some sectors, have truly been shaken by the events of the last 18 months and may have a much harder time rebounding.
So this is a great question. And the short answer is we don't know yet, right? If Benjamin and I both knew, then we could go and invest in those things that we knew would expand and short sell the things that we knew would contract. And we would retire from our positions at McGill and we would become filthy, filthy rich investors. But you see us still at McGill doing our jobs at McGill because we know that we don't know which sectors will expand and contract. But I have no doubt that there will be some that will expand and some that will contract. And I think it's fun to think about them. So, you talked about, will this be the end of bricks and mortar shops? I don't think this is the end of bricks and mortar shops, but I think this will be the rise of some things. So I've actually started using Peloton as not the bicycle, but just the, on the iPad, I can do a workout for 20 minutes or half an hour. I don't know how long Peloton has been with us, but I just suspect that concept of having an exercise routine that you can do online at your home without going to a gym is just going to be viewed as a convenient thing. So I suspect that will do well. You mentioned real estate. I was just reading a newspaper this morning about vacancy in commercial real estate in Calgary. 35% of commercial office space in Calgary is currently vacant. I think we are probably moving into a world where we realize that maybe we can do some work at home because we've all worked at home for the past 18 months. We know that it works. We know that it's not really that fun, but we know that it works. So what will that lead offices to do? Will they reduce their demand for office space? I suspect many of them will. So I think there are changes coming. And I think, you can clearly predict them if you want, but you may predict incorrectly. So I think, I'm just guessing that Benjamin and I are going to keep our jobs where we don't have to actually put a whole bunch of money on the line to then make predictions that end up being wrong. But it is fun to think through this.
I agree. This is not, in my opinion, the right way to invest. Trying to, guess the big changes of the future because, well, probably you'll guess wrong. And even if you manage to guess, the connection between the big changes that are going to change the new products, the new industries that are going to change life in the future, they are not always the greatest for investors, right? Because when an industry is growing a lot, well, usually there's a lot of competition. That's not great for profits. That's not always great for investors.
Okay, Derek. Because Benjamin had said before in your question to Benjamin about have people changed their saving behavior, his answer was basically, well, not that much. And I think that feeds into your question to me about which industries are going to expand and contract, and will we be moving into a completely new world? There will definitely be some changes, but I actually believe that once vaccination rates are very high, and once assuming that a fourth or a fifth wave doesn't happen, I actually think that most of us want to get back to normal in most things, not everything, and the normal will be a little bit of an adjusted normal. But I think people will still go to theaters. I think for sure people will still go to restaurants. I desperately miss a restaurant, and I can't believe I'm very unusual in that respect. So I think we will get back to something that resembles normal life with some important changes around the edges, because I think we are kind of who we are as humans.
Right. Okay. Well, very well said. And I'm glad, Professor Ragan, that you've got Peloton on your list alongside your red wine and red meat, or is it wine and meat? I'm not sure. Nice balance there. So, Professor Croitoru, obviously it's clear that neither of you want to make any grand predictions. But I'm just again curious. I just want to go back to the issue of the global stock markets, which you referenced earlier, and ask you about the performance of the last 18 months. And I think one of the things that surprised a lot of casual observers, such as myself, is the strength and resilience of the stock markets, which have, continued to climb to record highs in spite of the pandemic and huge contractions in the global economy and a lot of, political craziness south of the border, earlier. So how do you explain this phenomenon, that the stock market just continues to keep chugging ahead? And are you concerned at all that we might be heading for a nasty surprise at some point?
Okay, so I'm not going to do any kind of precise forecast.
Mm-hmm.
But well, yeah, I can understand that the resilience of the stock market in itself is a surprise, but the fact that the stock market is not always that closely connected with the overall health of the economy is not a huge surprise, because there are so many factors that go into it, including psychological factors, that are related to the demand of individual investors for stocks. And if you look at history, well, for example, the stock market did great in the 1980s, 1990s, not well at all in the 60s and especially in the 70s, but actually the economy did better in the 60s and the 70s. Mm-hmm. So at this point, the one thing I would say, and I think I mentioned this earlier, let me elaborate, I think it's important, is that clearly stocks are relatively, after going up so much in the recent past, stocks are relatively expensive relative to corporate profits. So I think what this means is that the return that you should expect for the future is probably lower than what we have seen in the past, but that could really mean very different things. It could mean, probably there's going to be some kind of adjustment, but the adjustment could be many years of relatively mediocre returns, or the adjustment could be some kind of stock market crash and then a recovery. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I really don't know what's going to happen. Now, what I want to point out is that at this point, so maybe I scared people, by telling them, I don't know, yes, maybe there'll be some crash. But I want to point out that at this point, if you don't take any risk, what kind of return do you get? Well, basically zero, right? Because interest rates are so low. On the other hand, I really believe that, whatever happens to the stock market, even if there's a crash at some point in the near future, I really believe that the expected return is more than zero. Okay. Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, well, because you get so little if you don't take risk, completely refusing to take risk is very costly at this point. Mm-hmm. And I know people are very afraid of crashes, understandably, but I think sometimes people are not afraid enough of not being in the market when it's going up is also a risk. And I actually feel, yes, a lot of people take too much risk, or they take them in the wrong way, but I think a lot of people actually do not take enough risk, and they end up with very poor returns in the long run. Mm-hmm. So I know I'm not sure I really answered your question. Should we be concerned about a nasty surprise? Well, probably we should be concerned to a reasonable extent. But if we look at the past, markets, or at least global markets, have recovered from crashes. So maybe for long-term investors, it's not the end of the world. You should not be overly concerned.
Okay, I think Professor Ragan wants to jump in as well.
I just agree with everything Benjamin said, but one thing, he kept saying, well, we don't know what will happen. So let me just say something provocatively. I know absolutely with certainty that there will be a nasty surprise in the future. And so does Benjamin. We just don't know when it's going to be, right? Right. The history of stock markets, they are, rising bull markets, and then there is a nasty surprise. And then it recovers and you have a rising bull market, and then there's a nasty surprise. So we know, I really truly believe that we do know with certainty that there will be a stock market crash in the future. But we don't know whether it's next month or next year or 5 years from now. And then you come back to what Benjamin said about, to go through a stock market crash is never fun, but to avoid the recovery period is also a very important source of loss. So I actually think one of the things that investors, and all of us as sort of retail level investors, need to do is get our head around the idea of taking a long view. You buy some stocks because you think they're good stocks, whatever they happen to be. And as Warren Buffett famously said once, if you're not prepared to hold a stock for 10 years, you probably shouldn't hold it for 10 minutes. And that, for me at least, that is an approach to investing that I hold near and dear to my heart. And that means when the stock market crash happened in March of 2020, I said, okay, well, it's fallen by 35% or whatever the number was, and let's hope it's going to recover again like it always has. And in fact, it recovered much more and much quicker than it did in past following past crashes. So I think we've just got long view.
I couldn't agree more. Obviously, yes, there are going to be nasty surprises at some point in the future, but they might not be the end of the world for disciplined long-term investors. And of course, what this means, well, this is why you should not sell in a panic, right? Because who is a crash a big deal for? Well, not for the long-term investors who are disciplined and patient enough. A crash is a huge deal for people who sell at the wrong time in a panic. Right. And I want to just add one thing, comment on one thing that Chris said. You mentioned buying good stocks. Of course, that's a good idea, but I'm assuming that a lot of people, and I would even include myself in that group, don't really know how to pick a good stock. What I want to point out is that you don't have to do that. You can do really well by basically buying a little bit of everything, which is very easy to do by investing in so-called index funds, which is really, so without talking about my own portfolio, which was really the core of my own investment strategy. So if you don't feel you know how to pick the good stocks, well, first, you're not the only one, certainly. And second, don't worry too much about this. You can do well without worrying about stock picking. Just buy a little bit of everything, and that's easy to do nowadays.
Okay, great. And I will give the website address at the end of this broadcast for the personal finance course, because I'm sure there's a lot of great advice in those modules as well. So, so just a reminder, if anyone has any questions and you're watching live, you can send them to us at aoc@mcgill.ca. We have a couple that have come in, but before we get to that, I just want to change tacks for 1 minute and talk about another, pretty significant, I guess, global issue that is out there right now beyond the pandemic, and that is the story of climate change. So this is one that's been decades in the making, but it feels like the world has finally woken up to the fact that climate change is here, and it will be dealing with the economic and social consequences for quite some time, if not forever. So Professor Ragan, I know that the intersection between the economy and the environment is something that you're quite passionate about, and you could probably speak about it all day if we let you. But in a couple succinct minutes, I'm wondering, what are you most concerned about from an economic perspective, and what ought we be doing to prepare for climate change right now, thinking about our economy and monetary policies?
So I think for the first time in maybe forever, the Canadian government, the federal government, has serious, well-designed, effective, and cost-effective climate policy in place. It has taken us a long time to get there, but and this all started, policies to address climate change really started at the provincial level with BC and Quebec, and then Ontario, and then that kind of got changed with government, and Alberta got changed with the government. And the federal government was late to the game, and it really required the election of Justin Trudeau in 2015. But in the past 4 years, we have seen that government, the federal government, develop a policy. They did their negotiations with the provinces. They had their little fight that went to the Supreme Court, and the federal government won that decision at the Supreme Court. So they now know that they can put the kind of policies in place across the country that they wanted to, and those policies are now in place. And so I would say this has been huge progress. If you look at like kind of where we have gone over the last 25 years, we now have serious climate policy in place, country to coast to coast, all three coasts, and that policy is designed to get tougher, if you like, more ambitious over the next 10 years. So I actually think we're on a very good path for climate policy. Now, there's still lots to do. I mean, I think as we start to talk about getting to net zero emissions by 2050, that's going to require more policy. And it's not just going to be a carbon price that gets us there. There's going to be big debates, I suspect, about public investment in new technologies. And there's going to be all kinds of stuff that we will be talking about over the next 10 years. But I think for the first time in many years, or possibly forever, we're actually in a good place in terms of our climate policy. And I would say this, Derek, you asked earlier about, are there differences on the political platforms across the parties? And I think there is a very important difference on climate policy across the parties. And I'm a nonpartisan person. I am not connected to any political party. But when I look at the climate policies from the Conservatives and the Liberals and the NDP and the Greens, in my view, the policy that is both realistic, effective in terms of reducing emissions, and also cognizant of the interaction between the economy and the environment, in my view, only the Liberal Party actually has a policy in place that it kind of strikes the right balance. And so even though I hate to say that because I like to be a nonpartisan person, if you are voting on climate policy, to me, there's kind of only one way to vote.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. And so Professor Croitoru, just I guess a similar question to you, or I guess my question to you would be, as climate change and global warming become greater factors in our lives, we're hearing more and more about sustainable or environmentally friendly investing. So I'm curious, is there a role for average investors to play in influencing environmental policy? And what advice would you have to support the planet and grow their personal wealth at the same time? Are these possible? Can you do both at the same time?
Yeah, so I feel it's a tough question to answer because sustainable investing has been growing a lot in the recent past, but it's still a relatively new trend. And I think the data is not completely conclusive. You really read contradictory things. So I would say overall, I'm cautiously optimistic on sustainable investing. And I used to be extremely skeptical because I felt, there's a lot of money in the world that doesn't care. But I think things are changing now. If you look at the data, in my opinion, if you decide to have a portfolio that's more sustainable, which means basically that it's going to avoid the so-called brown stocks, companies that pollute and that have bad practices, to focus on green stocks, I think there's probably a small cost in return. You might lower your return a little bit, but the good news is that you might actually also reduce certain kinds of risk. Because, for example, if you invest in companies that have better, greener practices, these companies might be more prudent, more cautious, managed in a way that is more honest. And also, these companies might be better prepared to face what might be coming.
Mm-hmm. In terms of policy and legislation.
Which means, exactly, or changes in the environment, or the risk of boycott. I mean, I guess that's a risk that's probably getting bigger and bigger overall, and that greener companies are less exposed to. So I would tell people, still, I talked a little bit earlier about buying a little bit of everything by purchasing index funds, which means diversifying your portfolio. I think this is still something that's very important. You don't want to sacrifice diversification to invest just in the greenest stocks. I think that would not be prudent. But I think sustainable investing makes sense within if you do it within, I would say, within reason.
Great. Okay, wonderful. So we have a few minutes left. Let's turn our attention to a couple of the questions that have come in to us from our alumni. In fact, the first one happens to be related to climate change. So that's maybe a good place to start. It comes to us from Guy Chartier. So he was wondering how climate change might inform options for work in the future. So I presume he's referring here to changing models and patterns for office workers, and whether environmental pressures might lead to more workers doing a greater share of their work from home to cut down on lengthy pollution-causing commutes. I know, Professor Ragan, you referenced this a bit earlier. So do you think that, there's going to be a connection between environmental safeguards and less office commuting?
Yeah, I suppose there will be a connection. I don't think it's going to be a huge connection, but it feeds back into the knowledge that we now have based on the last 18 months, that we know that some of us at least can work effectively from home. And though we may not want to work from home all the time, I mean, this idea that that an employer might have said 18 months ago, sorry, we need you in the office 5 days a week because it just doesn't work, and working on Zoom doesn't work. Like, we just know that's wrong. We know that, at least for many jobs, not all, but we know that for many jobs you can work at home, and so that is not necessarily an argument for working at home all the time and never taking the train to work, or never taking the bus, or never driving. But it actually kind of works in that direction. You say, well, hold on, we know that maybe we can work at home 1 day a week, or 2 days a week, or a few days a month. And that means, less driving or less taking a train or whatever. So I do think there's going to be a relationship. I don't think it's going to be a huge relationship. But, at the mark, addressing climate change is not just about the big headline policies. It's also about a whole bunch of little behavioral changes over time, over many people, that add up to making big changes.
Right. Okay, great. Again, if you have any questions, we have a little bit of time left. You can send them to us at aoc@mcgill.ca. We did get a question that came in just now from Fabrice Christian. I guess I'll flip this one to you again, Professor Ragan. Well, he's asking if the speakers can contextualize how much deficit we've racked up during the pandemic in comparison to previous crises in history. Was the spending allocated to corporations to protect jobs effective in saving jobs, or was it corporate welfare? It sounds like there's two sets of questions in there. So I guess in terms of the numbers, how does this compare to past crises? I guess the Great Depression, and then I guess there's a bit of a more loaded question about whether it actually worked or not.
Okay, so just first of all, on the numbers. So we increased the federal government increased its debt in the past year by roughly 18% of GDP. That's something like $375 billion, something like that. But it's about 18% of GDP. And you have not seen as sudden an increase in debt, certainly in the past 75 years. If you look at Canada's debt, the federal government, again, the debt to GDP ratio, it was about 110% just after World War II, 110%. And today, after that 18% buildup, the federal debt to GDP ratio is about 48%. So the federal government is in far better shape fiscally today, even with that big debt increase, than we were at the end of World War II. If you add in the provincial governments, we are roughly where we were in 1995 with a 90% federal plus provincial debt to GDP ratio, a little bit less, but we are getting close to where we were. So we are in better shape than we were at the end of World War II, but we are getting close to where we were in the early 1990s when we said, hey, our public debt is too high, okay? So we are getting close to danger territory. One important asterisk in this is that interest rates today on government debt are far, far, far lower than they were back in the early 1990s. So in the early 1990s, the interest rate on a 10-year government bond, I'm going to make this up, but it would have been a number like 9%, okay, or 10%. Today, that number is 1%, okay? So the interest service charges that our governments are facing are far lower today. And that's why you'll hear people like Chrystia Freeland say, yes, our debt is high, but we can handle it because our debt service costs are very, very low. Okay, so that's to put the debt in perspective. There was a second question, Derek, which was, hopefully Benjamin can do it.
Oh, well, this was about whether the spending allocated to corporations to protect jobs was effective in saving jobs. Or was the corporate welfare?
Let me give a very quick answer to that. The answer is, yeah, too soon to tell. So the government, to its credit, introduced a large number of very substantial policies very, very quickly. Like within a period of a couple of months, the government created these financial relief packages. So the CERB, payments to individuals, the wage subsidies, other programs that lent money, sometimes gave money to companies. I think once we do the analysis, and the analysis has not yet been done, once we do the analysis, we will find, I suspect, that some of that ended up being corporate welfare, in the sense that we ended up giving some money to companies that we didn't need to. But some of it was absolutely necessary for those companies to stay alive. And I suspect that there will be a whole bunch of PhD theses that get written over the next 10 years about the financial relief packages. And we will conclude almost certainly that it wasn't perfect. Okay. But kind of that's the nature of the beast when you're designing government policy in the middle of a massively uncertain health and economic crisis. Governments don't do perfect things. But I think the government, frankly, deserves a lot of credit. And here I'm talking specifically about the federal government. I think they deserve a lot of credit for the financial packages that were designed. Now, there I am sounding again like a partisan liberal, when I'm not trying to be a partisan liberal. I'm just trying to be a practical macroeconomist.
Right. Well, maybe I'll try to save you a bit, Professor Ragan. I mean, we could look at the United States. I guess there, it seems like, I won't say they're moving to a socialist system, but I mean, some of the packages that the Biden administration is putting forward are quite, I guess, quite surprising for a government like the United States, a country like the U.S.
Well, and so the U.S. public debt situation is their public debt to GDP ratio is higher than it is in Canada. Now American exceptionalism, I think, extends to American fiscal exceptionalism. So I think things that may be true for a smaller country like Canada may not be true for the United States. But I do think that the United States and Canada's public debt situation and that of the other advanced countries deserves some discussion. And I think and I hope that we will start talking about that in the near future.
Okay, so we're just about out of time. Before we wrap up, maybe I'll just throw one final question to each of you. We only have a couple of minutes, but I know you guys have both been not very eager to make predictions, and that's fine. You'd like to look more, research more of what's happened and what's going to happen in the future. But I'm just curious, from an economic, monetary, investment perspective, whether we should be optimistic or pessimistic about where we're headed in the next 12 to 18 months, or I'll give each of you an opt-out if you want. Is it too soon to know? Professor Croitoru?
No, it's too, sorry, I'm going to insist, I don't make forecasts, right? But I try to give investment advice. Well, you should maybe consider a few scenarios and make sure you're sort of okay at the minimum in all of them. Okay.
Professor Ragan, you want to take a stab at that one? Sure. And I will go out further on a limb than Benjamin was prepared to do. So I suppose I'm reasonably optimistic. And the test of that statement is that I'm not selling everything I own in my financial portfolio. I am happy to hold it because, again, while it may crash next month or 6 months from now or a year from now, I'm taking a long view. I'm older than Benjamin, but I'm still young enough to be taking the long view. And in fact, I think most people are young enough to be taking the long view. And so I guess that means I'm optimistic, Derek.
Okay. Well, those are very optimistic.
I'm not selling either. I'm willing to reveal this.
Benjamin's not selling either. There you go. So he's
all right. So too. All right, I'll mark you both on the record as optimistic. We'll see where we go. Anyway, well, that does about wrap up the time we have for today. Before we close, I would like to remind you that this video will be available at this very same link soon after our recording ends. So feel free to share it with others who may not have been able to tune in live. I would, of course, like to extend my deepest gratitude to our two guests, Christopher Ragan and Benjamin Croitoru, for joining me today and for sharing such incredibly insightful information on the future of the economy and personal finance. I know I've picked up a few valuable tips just participating and listening in. If you are interested in building your knowledge of personal finance, I would encourage you to consider enrolling in McGill's free online financial essentials course delivered by Professor Croitoru and other McGill finance experts. You can find more information at mcgillpersonalfinance.com, or you can just Google McGill Personal Finance and you'll come to the website. And please be sure to join us again in just over 2 weeks' time on Wednesday, September 15th, when I'll be joined by two of McGill's leading experts in urban studies and urban planning as we explore the effects of the pandemic on our cities and what strategies civic leaders ought to consider as they aim to rebuild our urban areas as vibrant centers of economic, social, and cultural life. Until then, please stay safe and be well. Thank you.